before the world knew wealth, before empires were written in textbooks. Africa was home to kings whose power and vision shaped the continent. From the legendary Mansa Musa to civilizations the world tried to erase. Today we uncover the history that refused to be forgotten.
They told you Africa had no history, no systems, no power worth remembering. That lie shaped textbooks. Borders, global hierarchies. But lies like this are never random. They are built, maintained, defended. Because if Africa was already advanced, then conquest was never salvation. It was theft. And once you understand what was erased, you'll understand why it had to be. Pause. This is not a motivational story. This is a recovery operation. Long before European expansion, Africa was not isolated. It was interconnected. Trade routes crossed deserts. Knowledge moved along rivers. Universities existed without stone walls. Governance was not chaotic. It was contextual. Empires like Mali, Songhai, Kush, Aksum, Great Zimbabwe did not rise accidentally. They rose because systems worked. Gold was regulated. Law was enforced. Spiritual authority balanced political power. This was not myth. This was infrastructure. The shift did not begin with violence. It began with curiosity. Foreign observers asked questions about gold, about roots, about control. Maps were redrawn quietly. Africa stopped being a partner and became a resource. And once the decision was made, the narrative had to change. Because you cannot justify domination over equals. Words became weapons. Cities became settlements. Universities became gatherings. Engineering became coincidence. African intelligence became luck. African governance became imitation. African spirituality became superstition. This wasn't ignorance. It was translation with intent. Because if you control language, you control memory. Libraries were dismissed, not burned. Oral historians were ignored, not executed. Artifacts were removed, not explained. What couldn't be destroyed was reclassified. What couldn't be reclassified was hidden. What couldn't be hidden was mocked. Empires don't always fall loudly. Some are erased politely. Control didn't rely only on force. It relied on division. Artificial borders. Installed leaders. Manufactured conflict. Unity was dangerous. Memory was dangerous. So both had to go. Africa was repositioned as beginning. Only when Europe arrived. Everything before that became prehistory. And prehistory requires no respect. But silence was not surrender. It was storage. Elders became libraries. Stories became archives. Symbols became safes. Truth was passed carefully. Privately. Selectively. Because survival sometimes means waiting. Technology reopened archives. Scholars re-examined assumptions. Timelines cracked. Ruins refused to disappear. Artifacts demanded These ruins still stand. Why these questions refuse to disappear? Why this story keeps returning? No matter how many times it is buried. Because history is not owned by those who write it last. It belongs to those who lived it. And now, the silence is breaking. The erased are being remembered. The fragments are reconnecting. The narrative is shifting. Not through anger. Not through revenge. But through remembrance. If you are hearing this, you are not late. You are right on time. Because history is not finished. It is being reclaimed. One voice. One truth. One listener at a time. And this is only the beginning.
They told you history began somewhere else. They told you power came from the north. They told you civilization moved into Africa, not out of it. But what if the very map of the world was drawn after the truth was buried? What if entire empires were removed, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too early? Tonight, you are not watching a history lesson. You are witnessing a return. Because when forgotten, history comes back. Power shifts. Before Rome carved its first stone, before Greece named philosophy, before Europe learned to write its own name, Africa was already old. Older than memory. Older than myth. older than the lies that replaced it. And that is where our story begins. Long before borders, before nations, before flags, there was land that taught humanity how to live. Africa was not isolated. It was central. Rivers were roads. Deserts were libraries. Mountains were temples. The Nile did not just feed Egypt. It fed an entire civilizational network stretching deep into Nubia. Kush, Punt, and beyond. People traded gold, cattle, salt, iron, stories, and stars. This was not a primitive world. It was an organized system. Cities had laws. Kings ruled with councils. Queens commanded armies. Priests studied astronomy with naked eyes and shocking accuracy. And while later civilizations fought for survival, Africa was already asking bigger questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? How do we rule without destroying ourselves? South of Egypt, beyond the cataracts of the Nile, rose a power older than the pyramids, you know. Nubia, later called Kush. Not coins. This land controlled gold, the currency of the ancient world. Power. Egypt did not conquer Nubia first. Egypt depended on it. Nubian kings ruled through wealth, faith, and discipline. Their cities, Kerma, Napata, were monumental long before conquest. And here's what textbooks rush past. Kush did not copy Egypt. Egypt copied Kush. The crowns, the gods, the sacred mountain Jebel Barkal, believed to be the throne of Amun himself. When Egypt collapsed under invasion and corruption, it was Kush that restored order. Black pharaohs marched north, not south. They did not loot Egypt. They revived it. This was the 25th dynasty, erased, minimized, renamed. Not because it failed, but because it shattered a future narrative. The Kushite kings did something dangerous. They proved that Africa could rule without Europe, without Greece, without Rome. They built pyramids more than Egypt. They trained professional armies. They unified religion and state. And they did it without slavery as an economic engine. That alone made them a threat, not just to enemies, but to future storytellers. Because if people remembered Kush, they would ask uncomfortable questions. So later historians shrank them, called them secondary, labeled them influenced. History did not forget them by accident. They were removed. When Assyria invaded, Kush retreated, not destroyed, just displaced. But the real destruction came later. Greek writers minimized Africa. Roman chroniclers reframed it. Colonial historians erased it. Maps were redrawn. Timelines were shifted. Credit was reassigned. And the world you were taught was born. A world where Africa was always behind. Always catching up. Always receiving. But history doesn't disappear. It waits. And in part 2, you will see how African power didn't just survive. It reshaped the world from the shadows.
While Europe slept in tribal forests, Africa was already feeding the global economy. Gold from West Africa lit the markets of Rome. Salt from the Sahara preserved empires. Ivory, iron, cattle, manuscripts, and knowledge moved across Africa like blood through veins. This was not random trade. It was controlled trade. Empires rose not where goods existed, but where roots were mastered. And Africa mastered them all. In West Africa rose empires so wealthy that historians panicked. The Ghana Empire controlled gold so tightly that raw gold nuggets were owned only by the king. Then came Mali. And then came Mansa Musa, the richest human being to ever live. When Musa traveled to Mecca, gold flooded Cairo so heavily that inflation lasted over a decade. Europe took notes. Arab scholars recorded details. And later historians tried to pretend it was a myth. But Timbuktu was real. Universities were real. Libraries holding hundreds of thousands of books were real. Africa was not illiterate. It was edited out. Mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine. African scholars taught Islamic Europe. African trade funded medieval economies. African navigators mapped stars long before compasses. And that terrified future powers. Because if Africa was recognized as a source, then Europe could not pretend to be the center. So the story changed. When trade could no longer be controlled peacefully, force replaced commerce. Slavery was not an accident. It was a systematic power grab. The goal was not just labor. It was memory destruction. Break the people. Erase the story. Rewrite the world. But something survived.
The transatlantic slave trade was not only physical violence. It was historical genocide. Names erased. Languages broken. Lineages cut. And yet, Africa did not disappear. It transformed. African knowledge crossed oceans. Farming techniques shaped the Americas. Music became resistance. Spiritual systems adapted, not died. Haitian revolutionaries defeated empires. African descendants forced the world to confront its lie. History fought back. Colonialism told Africa it had no past. Education systems repeated it. Media reinforced it. But archaeology disagrees. DNA disagrees. Ancient records disagree. Comma. And now, the internet disagrees. History does not belong to the powerful. It belongs to the truth. And when buried truth rises, power shifts. This is not the end. This is the return.
History remembers Mansa Musa as the richest man who ever lived. But wealth alone does not build an empire capable of reshaping global economies. Long before his famous pilgrimage shook Cairo and echoed across Europe, West Africa was already operating. within one of the most sophisticated trade networks on Earth, the story of the Mali. Empire is not just about gold. It is about structure, vision, geography, leadership, and timing. And once you understand the full system, you begin to see that medieval Africa was not isolated from the world. It was connected to it in ways that still influence global economics today. To understand Mali, you have to begin before Mali. Before Mansa Musa, before the gold caravans stretched across the Sahara like moving cities of dust and muscle. You begin with the collapse of Ghana, another West African empire that had mastered trans-Saharan trade centuries earlier. Ghana had grown powerful by controlling the flow of gold and salt between forest and desert. But when trade routes shifted and pressure mounted from internal and external forces, the structure weakened. Out of that shifting landscape, something new began forming. In the early 13th century, a leader named Sundiata Keita emerged from exile and legend to unify fracturing Mandinka states. His victory at the Battle of Kirina was not just military success. It was administrative rebirth. Instead of ruling through chaos, Sundiata built something structured. Provinces were governed by trusted officials. Trade routes were secured. Agriculture was stabilized. Tribute systems were regulated. The empire was designed to function beyond one personality. Geography was Mali's first advantage. Positioned between the gold fields of Bambouk and Bior to the south and the Saharan salt mines of Tagaza to the north, Mali controlled the most valuable exchange of the medieval world. Salt preserved food and sustained life. Gold fueled economies and symbolized divine authority. Whoever managed that exchange controlled power. Caravans crossing the Sahara were not small merchant trips. They were massive logistical operations. Thousands of camels moved in. Coordinated lines across hostile terrain. Guided by expert navigators who memorized stars. Dunes and seasonal wines. Oases became trade hubs. Languages blended. Islam traveled through commerce rather than conquest. And with it came literacy, law, and scholarly exchange. As Mali expanded, it did not erase local structures. It absorbed them. That flexibility allowed stability. Gold was taxed, but not strangled. Local rulers kept influence while recognizing imperial authority. This balance prevented immediate rebellion and encouraged economic growth.
By the early 1300s, Mali was one of the largest empires in Africa, stretching from the Atlantic coast deep into the interior. And then came Mansa Musa. When Musa ascended the throne in 1312, he inherited not chaos, but infrastructure. He inherited functioning trade routes, wealth reserves, diplomatic awareness, and an educated elite. What he added was global projection. In 1324, Musa embarked on the pilgrimage to Mecca, a religious obligation for Muslims who could afford it. But this was no ordinary pilgrimage. Contemporary accounts describe tens of thousands traveling with him, officials, soldiers, servants, scholars, and slaves. Camels reportedly carried enormous quantities of gold. Whether the numbers are exaggerated or not, what matters is the economic impact that followed. When Musa passed through Cairo, he distributed gold so generously that the local market was flooded. Gold's value dropped, and inflation lingered for years. This was not an accident of generosity alone. It was also diplomacy and spectacle. The message was unmistakable. Mali was not peripheral. Mali was central. European cartographers soon began drawing Mansa Musa on world maps, holding a golden orb. Knowledge of Mali's wealth spread through Mediterranean trade networks. Yet something curious happened over the following centuries. As European powers expanded, Mali's story gradually shrank in Western narratives. Not because it lacked importance, but because acknowledging its scale complicated a rising global hierarchy. Back home, Musa invested heavily in infrastructure and scholarship. He commissioned mosques, including the famous Gingerbread Mosque in Timbuktu. He encouraged scholars to settle in Mali. Timbuktu evolved into a center of learning with libraries housing thousands of manuscripts covering astronomy, mathematics, law, medicine, and theology. This is critical because the idea that sub-Saharan Africa lacked written scholarship collapses under the weight of Timbuktu's archives. The manuscripts were not symbolic. They were analytical. They contained star charts, legal contracts, medical advice, and philosophical debate. The empire functioned as a network. River transport along the Niger complemented desert caravans. Urban centers thrived. Agricultural systems sustained population growth. Governance relied on hierarchy, but allowed local variation. This was not primitive improvisation. It was statecraft. After Musa's death, succession became less stable. Some rulers maintained strength. Others struggled. As with most empires, expansion created strain. Peripheral territories tested independence. Trade routes shifted. And eventually, the Songhai Empire rose to prominence in the same region. But decline does not equal absence. Mali did not vanish overnight. It transitioned. It influenced. It seeded future structures. Yet, when European colonial narratives later described West Africa, they often framed the region as fragmented and disorganized, downplaying centuries of centralized power that had already existed. Why? Because history is not only about what happened, it is about which events are emphasized. The gold from West Africa entered global circulation long before European colonization of the continent. That gold influenced Mediterranean markets. It flowed into Europe. It funded trade and expansion elsewhere. The wealth was not theoretical. It was material. Even today, the ruins of ancient trading cities remain. Manuscripts continue to be studied. Oral traditions preserve genealogies that align with written accounts. Archaeology confirms extensive urban planning. The evidence exists across disciplines. The Mali Empire demonstrates that wealth concentration, trade integration, educational investment, and diplomatic signaling were not uniquely European phenomena in the medieval period. They were global dynamics. Africa was a participant, not an observer. And here is the deeper layer. When a society controls critical resources, it shapes conversations beyond its borders. In the 14th century, Mali controlled gold. Gold was currency, symbolism, leverage. The world noticed. The story of Mali forces us to reconsider assumptions about isolation and development. It shows that complexity does not belong to one region. It appears wherever geography, leadership, and networks intersect effectively. The empire eventually fragmented. Power shifted, but influence lingered. Cultural memory persisted. Trade patterns adapted rather than disappeared. The idea of Africa as historically disconnected cannot survive careful examination of Mali's structure. Mali was not a myth inflated by legend. It was documented by travelers like Ibn Battuta. It appeared on maps. It left architectural and textual records. It influenced economies beyond its borders. When you step back, you see something larger than a wealthy king. You see a system that mastered environment, leveraged resources, cultivated knowledge, and projected power across continents without colonial conquest. And that changes how you read history. Because once you understand Mali, you begin asking different questions about other regions, other narratives, and other simplifications. The empire that once flooded Cairo with gold still speaks through manuscripts, ruins, and economic records. It reminds us that global history has always been more interconnected than later textbooks suggested. Mali rose through strategy, geography, administration, and timing. It expanded through trade rather than relentless conquest. It invested in scholarship. It projected wealth strategically. It adapted across generations. And though its political dominance faded, its legacy did not. The gold caravans are gone. The empire's borders dissolved. But the imprint remains in architecture, archives, and the global memory of a pilgrimage so extravagant it disrupted economies. This is not a forgotten footnote. It is a recalibration. And once recalibrated, the map of medieval power looks very different.
Before borders, Africa was movement. People moved with seasons, with water, with trade. Rivers were not obstacles. They were highways. The Nile did not divide people. It connected them. Across the Sahara. What appears empty today was once a network. Caravans did not wander blindly. They followed known routes, mapped by memory, stars, and experience. Gold moved north. Salt moved south. Ideas moved everywhere. This was not accidental. It required planning, coordination, authority. You cannot run trade networks without systems. You cannot manage cities without governance. You cannot sustain populations without knowledge. Africa had all three. African power did not announce itself the way modern empires do. It did not require monuments everywhere to be real. Power was embedded in land control, resource flow, and social balance. Kings ruled, but not alone. Councils advised. Elders mediated. Spiritual leaders balanced authority. Power was layered. And layered power is harder to destroy because removing one layer does not collapse the whole structure. This is why Africa endured. Africa did not trust paper alone. Paper can be burned. Stone can be broken. So knowledge lived in people, in rhythm, in repetition, in story. Genealogies were memorized across generations. Law was spoken aloud, so everyone heard it. History was recited, so it could not be hidden. This made African societies flexible and dangerous to outsiders. Because you can seize a library, but you cannot seize memory that lives in thousands of minds. When outsiders arrived, they did not arrive with confusion. They arrived with curiosity. But curiosity is not innocent when it serves ambition. They ask questions. Who controls land? Who controls gold? Who decides disputes? They watch ceremonies. They observe councils. They noted weaknesses. Because conquest rarely begins with weapons. It begins with understanding. Violence came later. First came language. Words were changed. Cities became villages. Empires became tribes. Science became superstition. Africa was not described as complex. It was described as chaotic and chaos. Once accepted as truth, can be controlled. This was not ignorance. Comma. It was strategy. Gold left Africa without stories attached. Artifacts left without explanations. Sacred objects were displayed as curiosities, not because they were meaningless, but because meaning is power. If context is removed, ownership can be claimed. Empires rarely fall from one strike. They fall from fracture. Borders were drawn through communities. Leaders were chosen for obedience, not legitimacy. Trust was broken slowly. And when people turn inward, empires collapse quietly. History was reorganized. Africa was placed outside the main timeline. Everything before contact became prehistory. And prehistory does not demand respect. This was the final lock. But silence did not mean surrender. Silence meant protection. Elders became archives. Stories became shields. What could not be spoken publicly was whispered privately. Truth learned to hide. Now the silence is breaking. Ruins are being studied. Manuscripts translated. Timelines questioned. Technology did what censorship could not. It connected fragments. And fragments are becoming patterns. Africa did not begin in chains. Africa did not wait to be awakened. Africa was interrupted. And interruption is not erasure. History is not finished. It is returning. And when history returns, power shifts. History does not end when it is interrupted. It waits. Not in books. Not in classrooms. But in people. What was taken from Africa was not only land or resources. It was narrative. The right to define what came before. the power to say, "We were here." For centuries, the world was taught to look at Africa and see absence, to see beginnings only. When outsiders arrived, to believe silence meant emptiness. It did not. Silence meant survival. Because when truth becomes dangerous, it does not shout. It hides. In names passed down. In rhythms that refuse to disappear. In symbols carved where paper could not reach. In memory guarded by those who understood the cost of forgetting. Empires rose by convincing the world that Africa had no past worth defending. And empires lasted as long as that lie remained unchallenged. But lies age poorly. They crack under questions. Comma. They collapse when evidence is allowed to speak. Today, the archives are opening. The ruins are being read correctly. The timelines are being questioned. And the gaps in history, once ignored, are now impossible to explain away. Africa did not vanish. Comma. Africa was paused. And a pause is not the same as an ending. What you are witnessing now is not revision. It is recovery. Not revenge. Not replacement. But restoration. Because history is not owned by those who wrote the loudest version. It belongs to what endured. And the fact that this story is being heard again, after centuries of distortion, means something powerful. It means memory won. This is not the end of Africa's story. This is the moment. The story begins to speak for itself again. And if you are still listening, you are not just learning history. You are standing at the return of it.
These stories of Mansa Musa, Africa's great kingdoms, and the rise of power remind us that history isn't just in books, it lives in the land, the people, and the lessons we inherit. If you want more forgotten African history brought to life, subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us a continent esse true legacy. Which story amazed you the most? Comment below. I read every one.